This is Business Weekend with Ross Greenwood.
Hi there and welcome to Business Weekend. I'm Ross Greenwood. It's great to have your company today. Coming up on the program, Australia has a problem. Its economic growth is limited by a lack of productivity growth. If it tries to grow faster, it creates inflation, and that means the risk that interest rates will rise and not fall from here. We speak with the Shadow Treasurer, Ted O'Brien, and also the Chief Economist of the Commonwealth Bank, Luke Yeaman.
Rate cuts are certainly off the table for 2026 as far as we can see, and the possibility of rate hikes is firmly back on the table and building.
Now, oddly, one way we could boost our productivity is by using a resource that is underexploited, the night time. More than 8 hours go by with barely any economic activity, but now there's a push to become a genuinely 24/7 economy.
A vibrant nighttime economy is essential for any community, not just from an economic and productivity point of view, but also for the social benefit it brings, bringing people in together.
And on the subject of being a 24/7 economy, the government this week launched its National Artificial Intelligence Plan. There was just one glaring omission from that plan: money. We speak with one of the country's leading AI thinkers who worries the government's treating AI as a novelty and not as the game changer that it should be.
We haven't upgraded our supercomputing facilities in Australia since 2018, and increasingly all of the science that we do in Australia is starting to become reliant on using artificial intelligence.
So all that and plenty more coming up on today's program. But look, let's start with the economy as we often do. And this week's GDP growth numbers, they did pick up and there was an increase in private investment, which is welcome. But this all highlights again that Australia's economy is stuck. It's not the shining example of health that the Treasurer portrays it as.
I don't think the objective observers of our economy feel that that is in prospect. What we've been able to achieve over the course of the last 3.5 years or so is we've seen inflation come down substantially from what we inherited at the same time as we got wages growing again. We've had 2 years now of real wages growth. That's a good thing. You see in the national accounts today that the wages measure is pretty strong and again driven by private sector wage outcomes, and that's helping to drive a recovery in per person incomes as well in our economy.
Now, a point in time has to come when the Treasurer must admit that this government is responsible for the current state of the economy. Inflation, unexpectedly, is too high. Economic growth is too low. Productivity growth is tepid despite a high-profile inquiry, the results of which have never been published. And a Reserve Bank that this week said it just simply won't hesitate to raise rates if this inflation is persistent.
If a lot of it's temporary, we can look through it and we will start to see the trend back down towards the midpoint again. If it's not and it's more persistent, and we'll get more information on this in the next couple of months, then that's suggesting it to us that the demand pressures are persisting, and that might have implications for the future path of monetary policy. It will have implications for the future path of monetary policy.
So, what's the alternative? Well, Ted O'Brien is the Shadow Treasurer, and I caught up with him late this week.
Great to be with you again, Ross. No, it's not. Really what we see is an economy that's just limping towards Christmas here. It's very weak. We really just see again that habit of the government of getting bigger becoming more and more prominent. Here we have a government whose spending is growing faster than the economy itself. And that's bad news, because it just means interest rates will be higher for longer. It means real incomes will be lower for longer. That's the implication here.
Yeah, I pulled those numbers out actually from the budget in May. This goes back 2.6% increase in government spending in this financial year as compared with our economy, according to these latest numbers out this week, growing at 2.1%. And that kind of says it all, doesn't it? Because it means the economy is not growing fast enough to afford the government spending.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes to the two imperatives for the government. One, they have to stop the spending spree, and two, they have to start growing the economic pie. And the more it just focuses on spending taxpayers' money, well, it competes with the private sector, it competes with households, which is why it's just driving prices up. They're out there. competing for goods and services with everyday households and businesses, well, prices go up, inflation goes up, interest rates stay higher for longer. But it also means they compete for resources. And you have the resources of the economy in the less productive activities of the economy. And so that means that real wages stay lower for longer. And that's why Australians are feeling poorer, Ross, because, well, they are.
And the other point that a lot of economists I've spoken to this week have really referred to is the capacity constraints in Australia's economy, which means Australia's economy cannot grow at its long-term growth rate of 3%. And if it really tries to, then it creates inflation, in which case the Reserve Bank has also indicated this week that it's quite prepared to put up interest rates if it has to.
Well, this is just it. And so at a time when the economy is operating beyond its capacity, the last thing a government should be doing is pouring in more money and really, representing almost half of total demand. That's not what the government should be doing. This is the time where the government should be taking a back step. The government should be looking at deregulating. The government should be looking at ensuring there's better competition. The government should be looking at reducing energy prices. The government should be looking at taxation reform. The government should be looking at workplace relations. This is where the government should be focused. But instead, Ross, all we are seeing is a government which keeps spending money, and it only makes it worse.
OK, it seems also to me that it's a government which is centralising when you've got really every smelter and every foundry up the East Coast and around to Adelaide that's on life support right now, when you've got Rex Airlines effectively on life support right now, range of other businesses either in start-up phase or shutdown phase under government support with taxpayer money. That's really not really driving the private sector forward.
Yeah, it's certainly not. And where does it end is the question, right? If you were going to continue to subsidise rather than trying to deal with the problem at its source, then you're only going to be racking up more debt and going to taxpayers saying, please give me more tax. But that's what's happening. So where you have the smelters, as you mentioned, they've been very public, saying a core concern of theirs is the price of energy. Energy costs have increased by about 40% under this government. But instead of dealing with energy costs, the government says, you know what, we're actually going to tax taxpayers more. We're going to take out more debt so the next generation can pay for it just to keep these smelters running. So they're dealing with the problems at the symptom level rather than the source level. And that's where I think they're going so badly wrong.
It seems also to me that much of this really boils down to energy prices. Energy prices are where consumers are feeling a lot of pain. It's energy prices that create the inflation, which can move interest rates. It's energy prices which create industry to be uncompetitive. It's energy prices which really, if you like, are costing Australian taxpayers so much in the transition to the renewables future that the Labor government sort of sees.
And Ross, we have to remember that Australia might be an island, but we are part of the international economy. We're part of the global economy. And so what is happening by extension is Australia as a country is becoming less competitive. And so as the years drag on under this failed energy policy, Australians are becoming poorer, our economy is becoming weaker, and our supply chains are becoming more dependent on foreign supply chains. And that only leads the next generation to a future of poverty, and we don't want that.
But out of the economic growth numbers this week, the national accounts numbers, the one part of Australia's economy where private investment is growing right now is in data centres, is in artificial intelligence investment. That surely is the thing in the future that can drive forward Australia's economy, but that also is reliant on cheap energy.
You're dead right, Ross, and this is where, unfortunately, Australia is vacating the field because our energy policy is so shot. Here we have probably the single biggest reform, the biggest transformation of the global economy, certainly probably in our lifetime, and that is the emergence of artificial intelligence. And we're talking about private sector money here, not big government money. But because Australia cannot get its energy policy right, it means that we are losing an opportunity here. I mean, we don't have enough energy to satisfy our existing demand profile, let alone the thirsty data centres who need an abundance of energy to work. I mean, Australia should be ambitious when it comes to AI. We should be thinking expansively, not just about our own domestic economy. We should be the leaders of AI in Southeast Asia and beyond. We've got everything it takes in that regard, bar one thing. We've got all the energy resources we need, but we have such a poor energy policy, we have too little energy available. And where it is available, it's crazy expensive. And so, unfortunately, under this government, they will not be able to capture the AI opportunity.
I was going to ask you one final question, and that is, have you had a think about the economic style of this government? How would you describe the economic strategy, the economic style of this government?
I'd probably describe it as an enormous word salad, Ross, is the truth of it. In the budgets, they are meant to have a very clearly enunciated strategy. But there's not one numeral in their existing strategy. It's all words, and it's all driven by polling. But as anyone who does the budgeting at home knows, as anyone who runs a small business knows, it comes down to numbers. And this government, unfortunately, dare I say, this treasurer, is purely focused on the rhetoric. It's the words, it's the political communication. But in the real economy, what makes Australians prosperous, what makes our economy strong and fiercely independent, is actually the real economy. Numbers count.
I'll tell you what, Ted O'Brien, always good to chat to you. Many thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much, Ross.
So let's now get a non-political view on the future direction of our economy with the Commonwealth Bank's chief economist, Luke Eman. Now, Luke, I want to start with the Reserve Bank and interest rates. The RBA Governor, Michelle Bullock, this week was firm that the board will not hesitate to raise rates if this inflation spike proves persistent. But money markets now say the next move in rates is up, not down. They're saying from June next year. So what's your own sense about how our economy moves from here?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Look, the Reserve Bank picture has become much more complicated over the past few months. And as you say, markets have switched from an easing bias to a hiking bias. Our view is that we're going to see interest rates on hold through most of 2026. But given what we've seen on inflation recently, both the stronger than expected increase in the September quarter, followed by a stronger than expected increase in October, and given the broad strength we're seeing in the economy, especially this week in the national accounts, you put that together, rate cuts are certainly off the table for 2026 as far as we can see, and the possibility of rate hikes is firmly back on the table and building. Now, we're not there yet in our view. We still think that there's enough that will keep the Reserve Bank's powder dry, but we could certainly see rate hikes come onto the table next year if we keep seeing a stronger flow of economic data.
OK, so Luke, talk me through what's happened in the Australian economy to get us to this position, because it seems that we're almost out of whack with the United States, with New Zealand, with parts of Europe, with the UK, which are all still talking about cutting interest rates as inflation comes down and moderates. What happened here?
Look, I think there's a few things to point to, Ross, and one of them is a positive, and that is that we've seen a pretty smooth and orderly transition in the economy from public sector growth to private sector growth. Over the past few years, with private demand's been very weak, and we've seen the government sector step in and keep a floor under growth. Now we're seeing all aspects of the economy starting to pick up, and that's a good thing. We're seeing household consumption lift off the back of rising real incomes. We're seeing the housing market lift, and now we're also seeing, in the recent data that came out this week, business investment is also starting to come to the party, and we're seeing a lift in business investment, which has really been missing component of the Australian growth story over the past few years. So on the one hand, we're seeing a strong pickup in private sector activity. Government spending has slowed, but is still providing some support for the economy. So you put that together, that's not a bad story. The downside is that growth is starting to pick up, and it's getting closer to the speed limit in the economy, what we would say the economy can grow at without generating broader wage and inflation pressures. And the labour market is still quite tight. So the downside of stronger growth is that it starts to cause the Reserve Bank more concern that they're going to see inflation start to rise again. And that's what they're starting to grapple with now.
OK, so then you're talking about the so-called capacity constraints in our economy. Our economy can't grow faster than around about 2.25% or something like that on an annual basis without creating inflation. Why do we have that capacity constraint? What's caused that?
So our estimate is that the current capacity constraint in the economy potential growth rate is around 2.1%. And that has come down over time. And one of the key reasons that's come down over time is because productivity growth in Australia, also globally, but in Australia has certainly been on the decline. And lower productivity growth means you can't drive the economy as hard before you hit up against some of those constraints, before people start to fight harder for labour, for workers, and bid up wages, before people start to fight more for materials and goods and drive up costs. So that long-term decline in productivity growth is the biggest reason why we have not seen, why we can't grow as fast as perhaps we could in the 90s and the 2000s and previous decades.
OK, so given the fact that productivity, I was going to jump in there and say, given the fact that productivity is GDP in regards to the employment input into that. So that's the whole issue about that. So the question is whether this whole service economy that we've created in Australia through the NDIS, through childcare supports, through a range of different areas, whether this is the thing that's holding down the productivity, that the productive parts of our economy, mining, farming, manufacturing, the IT world, whatever it might be, that is being suppressed to the detriment, perhaps, of the growth of that service side of our economy.
I think that's definitely part of the story, Ross. I mean, we have to keep in mind that there's been a long-term global decline in productivity, and there's a whole range of reasons for that. And Australia has not been immune from those challenges. So part of the long-term decline in productivity here reflects those global factors. But there's no doubt that over the past 2 to 3 years in particular, we've seen really strong growth in Australia in the care economy, in the services economy, in disabilities, in health. And that growth does outstrip the rate of growth in many other countries around the world when we look at peer economies. And that shift from, as you said, higher productivity sectors to lower productivity sectors is dragging down the national aggregate. There's no doubt about that. There are some other factors. For example, mining, which is our most productive sector, has not been investing as heavily as it was in the past. That's also dragged down some of the longer-term productivity effects. But that shift in towards the care economy and towards more government sector, public sector jobs is part of the story on why productivity is lower.
OK, so then isn't there also a factor here that if our inflation rate now underlying is running at 3.3%, if the headline rate is running at 3.8% that we saw in the past week or so, isn't there also the danger that there will be increased wages claims going forward? If you're the ACTU, if you're a worker, you say, I want my wages to go forward in real terms. In other words, more than 3.8%. In other words, if you're getting wage claims of 4% plus in the coming year or so, isn't that simply going to continue to drive the inflation rate?
Look, that's a risk, Ross. I think at this stage we're seeing inflation expectations remain quite well anchored, and that's been the case throughout this large period of high inflation. The Reserve Bank Governor frequently comments on the fact that inflation expectations have stayed fairly well anchored. Overall, when we look at our internal data at CBA, we don't see a big pickup in wages growth overall. Wages growth have been easing as the labour market has eased. We did, though, in the national accounts this week, see quite strong growth in compensation of employees, so the overall wages bill for the economy, and some of that was coming from bonuses and redundancy payments and other things outside of the main core wage bill that we see week by week and quarter by quarter. So there is perhaps some early pressure there on the wages side starting to come through, but at this stage we wouldn't see it yet. I think the bigger issue for the Reserve Bank is, have we hit that speed limit, and are we starting to see inflation lift as a result of those broader demand pressures in the economy?
OK, given the build-up and the fact that there were 3 interest rate cuts at the beginning of this year, many people had forecast perhaps another 2 interest rate cuts coming into the end of this year, which, as we've agreed, have now gone and probably gone even for next year as well. Hindsight being hindsight, with 3 interest rate cuts from the Reserve Bank earlier this year, too many interest rate cuts, given what's transpired in our economy. Hindsight being hindsight, of course.
Look, it's a difficult question, Ross, and I think at this stage the Reserve Bank probably made the right call at the time. And we've seen overall growth picking up, inflation coming down, the labour market's been easing back towards balance, but it hasn't, really unemployment hasn't increased too sharply. So again, if you went back 4 or 5 months ago, you would have said that the right decisions had been taken. But for them now, the challenge has become much more acute. And one point I wanted to highlight is that we're starting this economic cycle, this economic upswing, with much less spare capacity. So not only has our rate of potential growth that come down over time to 2.1% because of those productivity challenges, but we're starting this cycle with much less spare capacity than we normally have. Normally, pre-COVID, if you think about the decade pre-COVID, unemployment in Australia was sitting at around 5 or 6%. Today, it's sitting at 4.3%. So we still have a lot more tightness in the labour market and a lot more tightness in the economy starting this cycle than we have traditionally. So that makes the job of the Reserve Bank more challenging and means they just have to be more responsive and ready to act more quickly. Doesn't mean they made the wrong decision previously, but it puts them on alert going forward, and they may have to act early next year if the growth in the economy starts to exceed our expectations.
I'll tell you what, Luke Yearman, Chief Economist at the Commonwealth Bank, always great to get your input, and many thanks for your time today.
Great to be here, Ross. Thank you.
After the break, we take you to the government's much vaunted National Artificial Intelligence Plan launched this week. A big problem is one of the AI leaders in Australia thinks it shows the government isn't taking the opportunity seriously. It's great to have your company here on Business Weekend. Well, this week, the government released its National Artificial Intelligence Plan. It has three aims: to build smart infrastructure, and for that, think data centres; to spread the benefit through widespread AI adoption, supporting and training Australian workers, and improved public services; and to keep Australians safe with legislative and regulatory frameworks that mitigate AI harms. Now, there seems to be something missing in that plan, though, and that would be money. One of Australia's leaders in robotics and AI, the University of New South Wales' Keay, described the lack of money in the following way: it's hard not to feel like we're turning up to a global race in thongs, asking where the starting line is, while everyone else is already sprinting to the finish line. Keay is the director of the University of New South Wales AI Institute and founder of the Robotics Australia Group. She's with me now. Sue, always great to chat to you about that. That was a cracking quote. I just had to bring it up there for people. But you get the sense that Australia, and particularly its politicians, still treat AI as some sort of novelty when the rest of the world is taking it deadly seriously.
Yeah, I think we haven't really come up with the realisation that we probably need to work out how we can be more self-reliant in this area. And, it is like we've been shopping around, to put that AI plan together over the last 7 years, and we've got to the checkout and discovered we've only got enough funding for an AI safety institute, which is great. And all of these things are a good start. But most of the rest of the world were at this starting point at least 7 years ago. And so we've got a lot of catch up to do. And, the reality is that it involves a mix of public and private investment. We can't just offload all of the responsibility for developing those things that you listed, the infrastructure, making sure we can spread the benefits, and also making sure we can keep people safe by foreign direct investment or by putting the load on private companies. So, yeah, that it really is the missing ingredient, how we're going to be able to fund a lot of these activities.
OK, so even this week, the national accounts showed that there was a big surge in private investment, which was caused largely by the building of data centres. Now, private enterprise, and some of it Australian private enterprise, is clearly building as quickly as it possibly can. But then you've got to have energy strategies, you've got to have water strategies, you've got to have all of these things in place to be able to drive that investment more deeply into Australia, and so that that investment feels like it's going to get a return. Is this something that you don't think Australia has addressed?
Yeah, well, I think what people don't appreciate is that private investment is actually not going towards some of the public infrastructure that we need. So we haven't upgraded our supercomputing facilities in Australia since 2018. And increasingly, all of the science that we do in Australia is starting to become reliant on using artificial intelligence. And the type of infrastructure that we need to be able to access is traditionally in every other part of the world funded through public investment. And while we don't have that public investment, it means that we really are not able to develop a lot of the AI talent that we need here in Australia, because we're not giving them the opportunity to build a lot of the AI models that we mean. And people might think that sounds a bit abstract, but I'm talking about the scientists who are working to develop personalised medical treatments so that, if you have cancer, they can make make sure that the drugs that they're giving you are, actually suited to you as an individual rather than just going off broad studies. These are things that have an impact on everyone's everyday lives, but perhaps people just really aren't aware. And unfortunately, we are already seeing that a lot of our AI talent is leaving Australia, and that is largely due to lack of access to compute. And that compute, it's great that we're seeing some private investment in developing this, but the core computing capacity that we require has to be funded through public investment, and we're just not seeing any commitment to do that.
Okay, one of the interesting parts about AI in particular, but it even goes to the whole internet revolution, is this notion of democratising where innovation can take place. In other words, you can innovate in the middle of Australia so long as you've got a high-speed internet connection, and you can then sell goods, products, services to the rest of the world. You can do it as easily in the middle of India, for example. So I just wonder with AI, it's going to take this even further, so long as we clearly have the right tools in place here in Australia. But what you're saying is that there's some doubt now as to whether Australia's going fast enough to have the right tools in place to allow Australians to take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, what I see is, I'm very privileged that I get the opportunity to work with some amazing AI talent who are developing fantastic technologies that could be of great use to the Australian public. And yet our ability to maintain our hold on that AI talent is starting to diminish. And that's a real pity, because I think Australia can really take the global stage if we were to lean into our strengths, which I would describe as being able to develop AI technologies in resource-constrained environments. Because as you've already outlined, there are a lot of concerns about how much energy and water artificial intelligence is requiring for us to be able to use it. And yet that's exactly the sort of solution that Australian research can be providing, because that's exactly what we're good at. But it's like we have decided, and certainly our Productivity Commission has been explicit in suggesting that we shouldn't be developing our own artificial intelligence, we should just be buying it off the shelf. And, unfortunately, that really shows a lack of ambition and a really, despite what it says in the action plan, it's showing that we're not backing our ability in this space.
So the other interesting part about this, and take me to the examples, because you're working very closely with these AI innovators, and you're saying they're basically, attracted to go overseas. Now, you said it's about the ability to get compute, so in other words, really sort of highly spec'd up computers so they can get the speed, get the access that they need. I'm guessing also there is the pull of them being poached by companies including Amazon or by Tesla or by Meta or whomever, because there is a global search for these types of innovators right now. They'd be attracted by the salary, they'd be attracted by the tax rate, they'd be attracted by the ability to work at the cutting edge of this artificial intelligence where they've developed their skills here in Australia.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. And so we do, in particular at UNSW, because we have the largest engineering faculty in Australia, we are training the AI talent of the future. And sadly, many of them are now finding that the opportunities overseas are too hard to resist. We are still fortunate that Australia is seen as a very attractive destination from a lifestyle perspective, but people are now having to balance, is a lifestyle really worth trading off their longer-term career prospects, when if you have a look at a country that has a similar sized GDP to Australia, they have pledged to commit the equivalent of 112 billion Australian dollars into AI, where we've put aside $30 million for an AI safety institute. So it's quite stark, the contrast.
And it seems to me, look, I get the sense you've been at this a long time, and robotics for a long time, I know, but you're kind of frustrated by what you're seeing now, by the lack of ambition in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I wonder why we have such a lack of urgency about this, because most other countries in the world started developing AI strategies around 2017, 2018, and also started investing accordingly. So, I spent a bit of time this year working with the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering to map out, what Australia really needed to do to get more on a level playing field. So we suggested that, if we invest about $1 billion a year over the next 5 years to developing our AI infrastructure, but also importantly, funding for researchers to be able to develop AI models which, have applicability to things like drug discovery and personalised medical treatments, that we would be in a good position, but we're just seeing no traction for those ideas at this point.
I'll tell you what, Sue Keay, Director of the UNSW AI Institute. It is always great to get your input, Sue, and many thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much, Ross.
Now, for at least 8 to 10 hours in any given day, our economy goes dark, literally. The night time, for some though, is an opportunity. It might also be one way to lift flagging productivity by utilising the night, together with cheaper electricity prices and easier access to our transport systems, to build business and also our economy. But there are barriers. Now the New South Wales Government and its Productivity Commissioner are working to unlock the night. On any given weekday, as commuters return home, the sun sets, the working day closes down, and so too does much of our economy. There are those, though, for whom night time is work time. Chefs, bar staff, restaurant staff, essential workers in healthcare, the police and security, plus transport workers. But for the majority, when the sun goes down, the productive hours also shut down. Now, though, governments are rethinking our working day.
This is very explicitly about making businesses more profitable after dark, but that's so they can reinvest in their workforce, give people better pay for doing that work after dark, but also cut costs for consumers. All those things are possible.
The New South Wales Productivity Commissioner, Peter Archdestrat, recently completed a report with 55 recommendations on ways to unlock the night.
The first set is in relation to how do we reduce red tape so that we can make it easier for people to start and operate and flourish a business. That's the first one. The second one, how can we make it easier and safer for people to travel in and out in the nighttime economy? And the third set of recommendations cover how do we let people know about all the new initiatives that have occurred.
Philip Barbaro, whose Avenue Group owns 6 venues across Sydney, is a prime example of a business operator who would benefit from a relaxation of rules and regulations for nighttime operators, especially when it comes to liquor licensing.
I applied for one of my businesses in Pyrmont. It took 9 months next to the Star City for a liquor licence to get approved, right? And that cost me probably around about $50,000 to get approved. Now, 9 months. Lucky I had the patience to do it. But if you're a new business owner, good luck to you. It is tough. There's too much red tape. We need to simplify it.
Well, we certainly need to be more flexible with the trading hours. I do recognise that there are situations where people who already live in an area, we have to be mindful of noise and traffic and things like that, and that's absolutely essential. But why do we take so long to come to a decision on that? Let's do it much quicker.
The store can only open if someone's there to buy something from the shelf, and that's really the role for government here, to coordinate that discussion across the city, across the state, to make sure we can deal with both the supply and the demand side of this equation.
There's another factor to working 24/7, and that's staffing. Do people actually want to work the nighttime hours? For Philip Barbaro, the answer is foreign students. Their restriction is their visa, which allows them to work 48 hours a fortnight, 24 hours a week.
Most staff want to work at night. However, a lot of my staff are on student visas. The 24-hour curfew, if you want to call it, of them not being able to work more than 24 hours hurts us, because that's an indirect cost to our business. So we're constantly training people.
Now, at this point, you might imagine much of the policy for an expanded nighttime economy is pitched at hospitality, but the nighttime is much broader than just that.
Thousands of health workers gathered together working after dark. It's a lot about logistics in the freight sector. Can we move some of that to the nighttime movements around the city, out of our peak commuter periods? So there's some of the big economic gains that could be driven by this agenda. This discussion that started talking about hospitality is now a much broader economic discussion.
And the opportunity of the night is exactly why Altus Travel has grown so rapidly, from a start-up around 20 years ago to more than 5,500 workers on its books today. It operates across 60 different locations and supports some of the biggest road and infrastructure building projects in Australia right now.
Probably about 60% of everything we do happens just as people are laying their heads on the pillow in the evening. So customers get much larger working windows when we operate at night, so the productivity uplift is really for our customers and for the communities that we're serving as we're maintaining this infrastructure.
But if you're one of those who says, I could never work nights, in future, and especially as more people work from home in the evenings, there will be a rethink about what makes up a day's work.
Our recruitment pipelines have never been bigger and never been stronger. I would have more than 2,000 people a month apply for a job to come and work with our organisation. So there's plenty of people out there from all walks of life that are willing to get out there and have a crack and be a part of what it is we're doing.
If we could operate more hours, 24/7, or even just till 11 o'clock in some cases. We hear situations where it takes up to 3 months and $40,000 to get approvals just to extend a couple of hours to be open. I mean, the business is already there, the infrastructure's there. We want them to open a couple more hours.
Allowing businesses to change what they're doing from the day to night, making that easier to do. These are all levers that we know make a huge difference.
I think everyone should be operating 24/7, Ross. I think, you can unlock an awful lot of an evening. We even have some of our planners and drafters that will work overnight. There's less disruption and less interference for them from other people in and around the office. We're definitely a big believer in running around the clock and running very hard at it.
And as the sun comes up on a brand new day, as a business operator, maybe you should just ask yourself about the opportunity lost in the previous night. After the break, since May this year, 66 companies have paid ransoms to hackers and cyber extortion gangs. It's the first taste of the stark reality some businesses face when disaster beckons if they lose access to that data. Thanks for being with us here on Business Weekend. Well, a revelation this week that 66 companies paid ransoms to cyber extortion gangs since May this year shows the precarious management task of protecting vital corporate data. Some of the famous cyber hacks in our recent past include Optus and Medibank Private. Subsequently, the government imposed rules that companies with turnover of more than $3 million a year must report cyber breaches, including whether they paid ransoms to the hackers. The advent of generative artificial intelligence only makes this risk greater, as sophisticated gangs use AI to discover weaknesses in corporate and government systems. Glenn Maiden is Chief Security Officer for Fortinet in Australia and its Director of Threat Intelligence for FortiGuard Labs, and I spoke with him earlier this week.
It should be the last answer, Ross. So we always say you never ever pay the ransom unless there's absolutely no other way out. You know, someone's going to die or you're absolutely got no other choice. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with criminals. Even if you pay that ransom, there's no guarantee that you're going to get your data back or your system's recovered. And more often than not, the bad guys will leave you alone for X amount of time and then come back and hit you again. So yeah, and make the moral of the story here is, Ross, make sure that you're prepared and ready. That's always going to be better than finding yourself in a ransomware situation.
So even since May, 60 companies having self-reported in this way, to me is shocking enough. But yes. I noticed the Home Affairs Minister saying that he believed that this was literally the tip of the iceberg, that there were many more underneath that may not have reported.
I believe that's correct. I mean, the ransomware is the scourge of modern times. It has been for about 10 years. The ransomware market has actually changed very, very significantly just in the last year or two. We'll probably talk about that in a moment. But the reality is they're sitting on top of an absolute goldmine in terms of illicit money to be made. So where there's money, they'll follow. We're a relatively rich nation in Australia. We've got big companies. We've had compulsory super forever. And they're still able to conduct these successful crimes. So they'll keep coming until we make it harder for them.
OK, so then making it harder for them, that's what every company, what every CTO is trying to do right now. The question is, are you capable of making yourself impervious to these types of attacks?
My view is, and this is going to be controversial, my view is yes. So I think we're defining the success or failure of an attack wrong. So we always say, oh, well, Ross has clicked on a link in his email, his system's got some malware on it, you've been breached. That's not the case. So if we look at defence in depth and we say, okay, well, Ross clicked on this link, but we were able to identify it really, really proactively and soon. We're able to isolate it so that incident was contained and that particular attack got nowhere as part of Sky News or anywhere else. They got nowhere where it caused significant damage. That to me is where we can get to, and we can get to that through smart design and really, really smart security operations, making sure that we identify when something's not right really, really quickly and then boom.
Okay, but that is also, I would have thought, vital for government intelligence.
Correct.
That would also be vital for financial intelligence. And you mentioned superannuation, and clearly now with more than $4 trillion in our superannuation pot, you'd have to think that every hacker in the world will be trying to have a grab of that. It's vital for our banking system. It's vital for our property conveyancing system.
Yes.
So many of these areas where it is vital that the pools of money, which hackers will be after, are protected in this way.
Yeah, look, I tend to be a little bit more optimistic than most because I've gone and visited some of the banks and some of these big super companies. This is a really, really difficult challenge, but these companies are doing really, really good work. And, again, a strategy from Home Affairs for us to be the most cyber-safe nation in the world, we've got some pockets of real cyber greatness, especially at that big end of town. Going to the more pessimistic view is when you sort of get to the small and medium enterprise and small business, that's where our soft underbelly is. And given that that's such a large, massive component, about 99%, isn't it, of the Australian economy is sort of, small business, 20 people or less. That's where I think we're really exposed.
And so for those small businesses, they literally have to buy protection packages off the shelf and hope that protection package and their own people are not literally opening the back door to potential hackers.
Yeah, and I really, really feel for the smaller end of town. I mean, I think there's it's hard, again, coming from a big security vendor, we try and scale out solutions that go from, the really big organisations all the way down to, a landscaping business or a hairdresser or something like that. But, it's when you look at the scale of the threat, you need to have, in a lot of cases, eyes on glass. You need to have, as I said before, defence on depth. So it's not just one silver bullet that stops every single attack. You need a few different security controls. So, that's very, very hard in that small business environment. But I have noticed some managed service providers that are starting to tailor some services more aimed at those smaller businesses, and that will hopefully make a really, really big difference that they can go and procure a service that's managed.
But the interesting thing about that is if I'm running a landscaping business, if I'm running, I don't know, let's think about something. I'm running a business that's maybe hiring out cars or hiring out equipment or something like that. That data's everything to me. But in the whole scheme of things, it's not a whole bunch of data, and nor is it of national significance. That's the other side of this. So that person might be very good as a landscape gardener, but they're not necessarily going to be brilliant at operating IT systems,
Correct.
Nor are their people. That's the issue.
And nor they should be, I guess, arguably, Ross. So I think, the national significance, I think when back in my time in defence and we looked at things like business impact levels, so, again, if a landscaper is managing their business with the appropriate risk management, they might decide to take a risk and not get those cybersecurity controls in there. Maybe they lose a couple of $1,000s. So, that might be a risk that's realised, but that was an acceptable risk to them. Whereas if you're a telco, and again, I guess we'll talk about telcos with state-sponsored actors soon, having a very motivated, malicious nation-state come in and compromise that telco, now that's an entirely different matter that affects all of us.
Well, see, and let's go to that point, because this is the whole point as well. And we've got to understand that hackers are very well resourced. And we've heard from the head of ASIO, we've heard from the Minister for Home Affairs. Both of them talk about the state-sponsored actors who are coming for this material. Now, that is not as much as having that material. That's about being able to manipulate that material if and when they wish to in the future, if there is conflict with that nation, for example. And Correct. China's the obvious one that people talk about.
And I know we spoke about this when I was here before, Ross, and I think people are just starting to click onto it now, like the general public. But it's one thing for a malicious nation-state to compromise, for example, a telco to conduct espionage now. But that access that they've got to that victim network is pre-positioning them for potential sabotage if there is a geopolitical shock. So they can go from stealing information through to running ransomware or some sort of destructive behaviour that could cause an outage or cause some sort of damage, which is going to be coinciding with some sort of geostrategic event. So that's the bit that I know we spoke about it last time, and that's the bit that really scares me. So we need to be very, very proactive out through all of our systems, hunting for these bad guys and getting them out now before something bad happens.
Okay, so then your organisation, Fortinet, you are basically analysing these attacks. You're looking at where the vulnerabilities are inside organisations. You're trying to, as one of many, trying to counteract and basically offset some of those threats before they really do become sort of real inside large organisations and, as you say, the small organisations as well.
So look, the funny thing is, I don't think that it's a technology problem per se. So a company like Fortinet, we can sell anybody anything that will be enough to stop them from the cyber threat. The hard part is any defence system's only as good as the technology, but also the people and process. So it's the people and process bit that I think that we need to work on. And again, there's a lot of really, really good work going in there in training people up, in getting people more exposed to security operations. So I think once we get those three things, even the most devastating AI attack, if we've got those, those back-end processes and that resilience in our networks, it's still going to only allow an AI attack a certain distance into our systems before we discover them and stop them.
Just one final one. You said earlier on that you believe Australia is almost at the forefront of the world. So that would, to me, say that the government has really understood the threats, understood the risks, and has been really proactive in trying to basically head off some of the future risks.
I wonder if I'll get beaten up for such a hyperbole. I think in pockets we are at the forefront of the world. So, if you look at sort of some of our retail sectors, if you look at our banking sectors, if you look at even some of our telco sectors, very much at the forefront of the world. I think our geography does work against it. So once we start to get into places that are sort of more north and more west, and that's where we've got a lot of obviously critical infrastructure, mining, electricity, those sort of places, I think that's where we're probably a little bit more exposed. But I think we've absolutely got everything that we need to realise that vision of being the most cyber secure by 2030. And to be honest, the government has done a pretty good job in keeping on top of some of the key issues. So, and we all hate congratulating the government, but in this case, they've done a really good job.
There you go. Glenn Maiden, always good to chat to you. Many thanks for your time today.
Thank you, sir.
And that's it for the program this Sunday. Up next, all the latest news right here on Sky News. Business Weekend returns next Sunday, but you can keep up to date with all the latest business news with our daily program, Business Now, 4:30 p.m, Daylight Savings Time, and also via our website, skynews.com.au. Thanks for your company today. I'm Ross Greenwood. We'll see you next week.